The Edmonton Oilers trade deadline acquisition of Adam Henrique this past spring looked like a shoe-in for a long-term successful partnership. Henrique re-upped in the offseason, but so far, the numbers haven't been there. Is this cause for concern, or is Adam Henrique simply getting unlucky? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on today's show, a nice deep dive on Adam Henrique. If you're familiar with me as the host of Locked On Oilers since April, you know I love doing these deep dives, going behind the numbers, looking at the context, trying to piece together what a player's performance says about what they're doing, how much of it is luck, how much of it is good performance, how much of it is just the way the game is playing out. So on today's show, the context, the counting stats, what the underlying numbers say, and then I'll give you my best shot, my best working theory as to why Adam Henrique's counting stats aren't where they should be, I should say. So, at the outset, let's start with the obvious. Adam Henrique is old by hockey standard. To be at Adam Henrique's age of 34 years old and still playing relatively high-level hockey is an outlier. And of course, there are degrees of outliers. You know, Sidney Crosby at 37, 38 is a very different tier of outlier than Adam Henrique at 34. But Adam Henrique is not playing poorly. He's not playing bad. He's just been very blah. He's nothing special, nothing terrible. And there's an assumption that Henrique would be giving them a little bit more than he is. And some of that is based on his career track record. And some of that is based on the idea of the success he was able to have in the postseason when he did play, when he wasn't injured, and the end of the regular season in Edmonton. But let's back up a step and let's go to the context, because it's imperative that we understand how a player's numbers come together. Because as we've long since established, if you're a regular listener of Locked On Oilers, you know the single most important predictor of counting stats is time on ice. Thank you. If you were listening and you said time on ice, thank you. I appreciate you doing your job as a good listener. But the single most important thing is time on ice. And that's why statistically, we typically see players peak counting stats wise in their late 20s and early 30s, because that's when their talent most matches their reputation or credibility. You know, it takes you a while to work yourself on to one of those first power play units or a PK, or you know, if you're an all-world player and you do it all the way, pretty much right from the get-go, that's different. But most players, you know, the average NHL player is going to see their peak statistical production 27, 28, 29. You know, you get that first big free agent contract and you sign somewhere else. That team is going to have an impetus to put you on their first power play unit and to give you more ice time. So with that in mind, we can look at Adam Henrique's numbers this year versus last year. So, number one, this year so far, he is averaging 14:36 of average time on ice. That is 14 seconds less than his time in Edmonton last year. 12:20 of even strength, 38 seconds of power play, 137 of penalty kill. Okay, all of that makes sense. We understand that the Oilers have been very strategic in their forward usage so far this season, and they have really tried to find whatever it takes to get their offense going, because for large stretches of the season, I shouldn't say large. For the first month or so of the season, the offense was hard to come by. The Oilers were more inclined to double up on McDavid and Draisaitl together. Henrique, not as much of a priority. But with all of that said, there's also the consideration that this year versus last year, Henrique's playing a lot more of his ice time against bad competition, you know, fourth liners and bottom sixers. His last full season in Anaheim, he was playing 35% of the time against elite competition. This year, that number is under 30%. And then 36.8% against middle six guys in his last full season in Anaheim, 22-23. So that's the first part of this conversation to understand. Adam Henrique went from being a veteran presence who was getting paid a lot of money on a bad team. He was being expected to kind of steer the ship, be a sounding board, a leader on a young, poor team. And he got power play time. He got first power play unit time, and he played with high end talent. And when your responsibilities change, so do your time on ice and so do your counting stats. You know, this isn't all too dissimilar than the conversation we've been having about Jeff Skinner over the course of this season so far. He went from playing with Alex Tuck and Tage Thompson to playing with Connor Brown and Adam Henrique. You know, that is a serious difference and expectation. The next component to this, of course, is line mates. And we said it right there. Henrique's most common line mates this season, Connor Brown and Matthias Janmark, and then Jeff Skinner and Matthias Janmark. That's almost 50% of his time on ice this year was with those two forwards. And again, the responsibilities Henrique has when he's playing with those guys are different than what you would say he had when he was in Anaheim. And that line's responsibility in general is a little bit different than what you would expect. And look, when they're out there with Henrique and Connor Brown, Janmark is out there with Henrique and Connor Brown. We know Janmark and Brown are using their speed to create space. We know Henrique is the slowest guy of those three forwards. In a vacuum, these skill sets match up reasonably well. You have two really speedy wingers who have okay offensive instincts. You have Henrique, who has decent defensive instincts, even though the numbers aren't there this year and haven't been there for a few years. He's okay defensively. And in an ideal world, you would envision Henrique serving as a bit of a facilitator, you know, chance creator, setting up his speedy wingers, and then more or less covering for them defensively. You know, if you were to try and draw it up, if you will, if you were to try and have the concept of what this line is supposed to be, that's how it would work. Then the most common defensemen Henrique has played with, Emberson and Stetcher, and then Nurse and Kulak. Again, the defensemen you get deployed with, tell me your responsibilities. Being deployed with Emberson and Stetcher, and Kulak and Nurse, that tells me you are out there to try and quell the game down, bring down the temperature, slow down the speed of the game, better defense. Let's control possession. Let's work a little bit more for our offense, and let's make something happen. And it is hard to live this way. You know, it's hard when you're out there and you don't have the most talented wingers or the most talented defensemen. And look, none of this is excusing the fact that Henrique hasn't really put up the counting stats this year, but the context does matter. You know, you're only getting out there on that second power play for 40 seconds. You're playing with Brown and Janmark. You're playing 14 something minutes a game. You're playing with defensemen who don't really tilt the ice all that much. All of that added up, it's natural to expect a points decline, a counting stats production decline. And that's not to say there isn't meat on the bone still, and we're going to talk about that in the next segment when we look at the underlying numbers. But all of this context does matter. All of this context does provide a more detailed picture than just looking at the goals, the assists, and the shooting percentage. We're going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll look at the underlying numbers and try and get a better understanding of what's going on with Adam Henrique, coming up right after this. If you guys know me as the host of Locked On Oilers, you know I love going to things. Went to so many concerts, so many games this past year. One of my favorite memories last year was going to Gov Ball Sunday, seeing Chapel Road, seeing Renee Rapp, seeing SZA. Now, our friends over at Gametime have made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Gametime Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you won't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. My friends and I were talking about going to bull riding tomorrow at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, and with Gametime Picks, we found amazing deals, and we could see the view from our seat before buying. So if we go, the only place we'll be getting our tickets is through Gametime. The super deal was particularly impressive, offering great seats at unbeatable prices. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front with no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. Thank you to everyone who's hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On Oilers. And hand up, I was in bed yesterday running a fever most of the day, lost like 7.5 pounds over the course of a day and a half, got what I assume really nasty case of food poisoning from a burrito on Tuesday night as I was getting ready to go to a New Year's Eve party. So I got to the New Year's Eve party, instantly got sick, and was home from said New Year's Eve party by 11:15. So I spent the entirety of my Tuesday and Wednesday curled up in bed, like slowly feeling my will to live exit my body. But we're functioning today. Definitely not 100%. I owe you guys an episode. We will definitely have a third episode between today, tomorrow, and Saturday, even if it is on a Saturday. I got you. No worries. Building off of this, more Adam Henrique conversation. I always start with the context, because context for a player is so invaluable in understanding counting stats. Because like, even if a player has great underlying numbers, they have great expected goals, great high danger, the great scoring chances, good on ice save, good on ice shooting. If you're not playing a lot in favorable situations, you don't have great line mates with great finishing talent, it makes sense that you would have less than stellar counting stats. Now, of course, there are layers to this conversation. A player who plays 14 minutes a game, who gets sparse power play time, who doesn't play with wingers with high-end finishing talent, you're going to expect them to not be able to do as much. But I think a lot of the conjecture around Adam Henrique this year has been rooted in the low counting stats. 3 goals, 7 assists through 35, 36 games. That's not really enough for what the Oilers are asking Adam Henrique to do. And when you look at the underlying numbers, Adam Henrique this year, 46.8% of the scoring chances, 51% of the goals for, 46% of the expected goals, 52% of the high danger, 7% shooting on ice, and then 933 saves. So that tells me a few things. Number one, it tells me that when Henrique is on the ice, the other team does have the puck more because more scoring chances, more expected goals. But being that the Oilers have more of the high danger chances when Henrique is on the ice, that tells me A, my supposition about Connor Brown and Janmark being the high danger creators because they have their speed and they're able to drive the net, odd man rushes, that type of thing. That tells me my theory there in that regard is true, at least. But when you compare those numbers to what Henrique did last year in the regular season in his limited time, his scoring, his everything was relatively close. All of those underlying numbers were within 2 or 3% of what they were in the 15 or so regular season games he played last year. The one big difference, though, in his on-ice shooting percentage, which is the shooting percentage of Adam Henrique and the 4 other line mates he happened to be on the ice with at the time in their situations, was twice as high. They were shooting almost 15% in their ice time last year, as opposed to the 7% they're shooting now. And look, 7% is a little low. League average is about 9% at 5-on-5. So you would imagine that number should be a little bit higher. But again, none of Janmark, Henrique, or Connor Brown are particularly high-end finishers. None of those guys is a 14 or a 15% shooter. You get 3 slightly above average shooters together, and I don't think any of them I would classify as above average at this point in their careers, but you get 3 good NHL players. I think all 3 of these guys are functional, useful NHL players and can be really useful on a good team. And I do think Adam Henrique has some value that's left to be hit, if you will. And when you look at the stats of Henrique when he plays with Connor Brown and Janmark, they're all better than his standalone season stats. His 50% scoring chances, 55% goals for, 57% expected goals, 58% high danger, 9% shooting, and then 902 save. All of those numbers are better with Janmark and Brown than they are with another combination of forwards. And I do think using your 2 speedy wingers as a buffer or protection for Henrique's lack of foot speed. And Henrique's not like that slow. We're going to get to his NHL edge stats in a minute. He's not that slow. But for today's NHL, he's a little slow. So, there's levels to this game. And trying to get the most out of a player is any coach's goal. I always go back to a Bill Belichick quote. Bill Belichick, for all of his perceived personality warts, he's, abrasive, not that nice a guy. I still stand by him saying there's no such thing as an untalented player. If you get to the highest level of professional sports, you have to have something you're good at. And it's incumbent upon coaches and a front office to identify that and put you in a position to succeed. You want to see guys doing things they're good at. You want to see them have the opportunity to do what they are good at because it's going to bring the best out of them. If you're going to ask Adam Henrique to play first line left wing and be a defensive specialist with Zach Hyman and McDavid, I think that's a little bit of a tall ask at Adam Henrique's age. Now, if you're asking him to occasionally chip in a goal or help create a goal every few games, play responsible defense, and not give the game away, I think that's doable for what Adam Henrique is at this phase of his career. I think that's the good outcome for what he's brought to the table this year. And then I mentioned at the edge stats, this year, 78th percentile top skating speed. Last year, below 50th percentile. This year, 52nd percentile bursts over 20 miles per hour. Last year, he was below 50th. This year, 67th percentile in skating distance covered. Last year, 79th percentile in skating distance covered. So he's skating a little bit better than he did last year, but skating less distance in the games he is playing. So adding all of it up so far, we have less ice time. We have lower quality wingers. We have lower quality defensemen. We have worse shooting luck. We have slightly worse underlying numbers, scoring chances, expected goals, high danger chances, all of that together on a team that hasn't had the best of finishing luck. I think you're starting to get an understanding of where I'm going. I think Adam Henrique, at this phase of his career, is more of a passenger than a driver. And every team needs depth. Every team needs 12 forwards. And I don't think Adam Henrique is driving his own line. And frankly, I don't think Adam Henrique has driven his own line in quite a while. But I do feel that he's playing fine. There's a whole lot more to get to, and we'll talk about it coming up right after this. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. The NFL playoffs are almost here, but it's not too late to get in on the regular season action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can finish the season strong with $250 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. FanDuel has so many ways for you to pick up a win, like betting on props like touchdowns, how many points each team will score, receptions, or yards. This weekend, 2 games on Saturday. The Browns heading to Baltimore, where the Ravens are 18.5-point favorites. The late game on Saturday, Joe Burrow and the Bengals fighting for their playoff lives against the Steelers, where the Bengals are 1.5-point road favorites. And then one of the best games all season, Sunday night, the Vikings going to Detroit to take on the Lions, where the Lions are 2.5-point favorites. Visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your chance at $250 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are talking all things Adam Henrique and the slow start to his season. And all of the context and all of the environmental factors, when you piece them all together, I do think we should at least passively discuss the idea of the Oilers buying the Chiefs. And everybody wants their trade deadline acquisition to work out, to work well. And I felt Adam Henrique did exactly what was asked of him last year. I thought he was a very timely and logical addition. Frankly, I thought Adam Henrique was a good fit for a lot of the teams that were in need of that depth veteran forward. And I think everybody kind of had an understanding that the shooting percentage was insane. I'm looking at his hockey reference page right now, and in 22 games as an Oiler, he had 6 goals, 3 assists on 20% shooting, and that number's insane. 20% shooting is way too high. That's just not realistic for what he is. And then in the playoffs last year, 17 games, 28.6 shooting percentage. And some of me is convinced that the Oilers may have maybe gotten a little too excited about their acquisition working out for them and him fitting. And it should not be overlooked that Adam Henrique took a sizable pay cut to come back to the Oilers, that there was a market for him from other teams. The Lightning were one of them, if I recall correctly, that wanted to bring Adam Henrique into the fold in the summer, and he chose to take less money. He wanted to stay in Edmonton, and he wanted to be an Oiler, and we shouldn't look past that. I do think that does mean something. How much or how valuable do I find that? I can't put a finger on it because I am not running the team and I don't know the day-to-day as well as the guys on the team. But when you have a teammate who's willing to take a little bit less money to stay where he's at because he believes in what's going on, that's validating. That's a good feeling. That's something you want to build off of and work with. And it speaks to a strong culture. You know, if guys like what's going on and they want to stay and they're willing to be amenable in a different ways to staying, you know, whether it be situation, finances, or what have you, I do think that's a good sign. And I make fun of Ken Holland's tenure a lot. I make fun of the Oilers' inability to graduate any prospects a lot, but over the course of Ken Holland's tenure, he stabilized the Oilers enough that they are both a serious Stanley Cup contender. And look, not a lot of it is through his own doing. You know, most of the core pieces of this team were in the organization before he got here. But the Oilers are where they are now because of what happened during his tenure. And Henrik was, I should say, a good topical ad that made sense. A depth winger, not a lot of experience in the postseason, but a lot of NHL experience. And he missed quite a few games in the playoffs and had the nagging injury in the postseason. But when you have that good a landing where you come into a new team, you have the great shooting percentage, you do a really nice job in your depth role, especially in the Cup final, where you, Janmark, and Connor Brown really put together a strong supporting cast role that really helps and really helped close the gap against Florida, because Florida was doing a great job in that series, man. Florida was doing a really good job of slowing the Oilers down, and it was Janmark, it was Connor Brown, it was everybody, you know. It was an all-hands-on-deck type performance that got the Oilers back. Now, can you say the Oilers maybe have a smidge of buyer's remorse of signing the 34-year-old who had the crazy shooting percentage in a short playoff run? Sure, you could say that. You could say that about Jeff Skinner. You could say that about Arvidsson. You could say that about quite a few of the offseason decisions the Oilers made. But of those guys, I think Henrique is really, I think of those three guys, I think Henrique is doing the most he's been asked of them. You know, he is living up to his expectations the most. You know, I pegged Adam Henrique for maybe 30 to 40 points, maybe 10, 15 goals over the course of a full season. And I think those are reasonable expectations for a forward who's not playing first power play, who doesn't have great finishing on his line. But adding it all up and trying to get to the bottom of this, that really kind of, it makes you think in the abstract a little bit more. It makes you think a bit more philosophically, because Henrik is still functional. He's not bad. He's not a black hole. He is not killing the Oilers, but the Oilers are expecting a little bit more out of him. And that's reasonable. You know, what you're paying him, you would expect him to finish with about 35-ish points. You know, when the salary cap was flat, my working pay scale was 10 for every 10 points, $1 million of salary. If you score more goals than you do set up more goals than assists, each 10 points is worth 1.5 million. So, you know, if you're a 35 goal guy with 50 some odd points, you should be worth about $5.5 to $6 million. That's a working baseline. And for what Henrique is bringing to the table, the Oilers probably need a little bit more in terms of what they're paying him, because they're paying him a little bit more than they were paying him when the Ducks had retained some salary. Corey Perry is getting more than he got last year. Janmark is getting more than he got last year. And you took a lot of money out of your team's defense because you felt that all you needed was offense to get over the hump. And your defense is doing more than fine in terms of holding up their end of the bargain. And if the offense is what's continuing to struggle, that should give you pause. And all it takes is one good run to get out of a funk. And I don't think, like I've said more than once this whole episode, I don't think Adam Henrique is playing poorly. You look at the underlyings, you look at the shooting percentage, and it should be stated as an individual, he's shooting 5% right now, and for his career, he's a 15% shooter. But you also have to keep into account the fact that he's just not shooting the puck nearly as much as he has in years past. So 37 games this year, he has 57 shots on goal. Last year in 60 games, he had 111. So, it's about 10, 15 off over the course of a full season. But the Oilers are going to need a little bit more from their depth. And if they can get just a little bit more from their depth, ease some of the concerns about Arvidsson, Skinner, all of it can come together. And look, none of this is disqualifying. Like, you're a third line, 34-year-old center getting off to a slow start in his 34, turning 35 season is not the end of the world. It doesn't mean that he's cooked, that the Oilers are in trouble. It does mean he needs to play better, though. And I do think that is worth saying here. You can both say, I don't think he's playing that badly, but he needs to play better. The underlying numbers are okay, but he needs to play better. His shooting percentage is very low compared to his career average. He can be better. All of those things can be true simultaneously. I know nuance and multi-layered thinking in sports media is very frowned upon if you think about who's out there in the real world making moves, unfortunately, but all of this is true. And tying a bow on this episode, I think if the Oilers feel comfortable with Henrique and they're not dropping him in the lineup and he's meeting what their expectations are for him, I think that's workable. If we see him dropping to the fourth line, then that's a different conversation. But right now, Knoblauch feels okay about him. And in this case, that is enough for me for a tertiary supporting player. If a star is struggling and a coach is sticking with them, that's different. But for a tertiary, a supporting player to be playing meh and still have an endorsement of the coach, that does matter to me. So that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're creeping up on 2,000 subs over on YouTube. If you could hit the subscribe button over there, that would be great. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.